Hello, everyone. You're watching Ukraine Breaking News. My name is Maria Kahal, and today we're speaking with a man who has spent decades working in the field of international justice and has witnessed some of the most significant tribunals of our time. Our guest is Mark Ellis, the executive director of the International Bar Association and an expert of international criminal law. He has worked with tribunals for Yugoslavia, Cambodia, and even participated in the trial of Saddam Hussein. With him, we will discuss how the world can hold war criminals accountable and what mechanisms could be applied in the case of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Hello, Mr. Ellis.
Hello, very nice to be here with you.
Nice to meet you too. Throughout your career, you have been involved in many historic trials. Was there a moment when you realized that international justice was working and really was making a difference in the world?
Well, I think it would have been with the creation of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That was the first tribunal since the Nuremberg trials after World War II. So it was clear that the international community had determined that the atrocities being committed in the former Yugoslavia, there had to be accountability for those crimes. And so the creation of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, I think, was, for me, the most important development of international criminal law since Nuremberg. And it was very successful in any way possible in judging the success of that tribunal. And it gives us hope, and it in fact set a precedent for other international tribunals that followed. And I think it's a good model for the number of the issues that they dealt with, which will be important with how Ukraine is handling its efforts to ensure that those leaders in Russia are brought to justice for the crimes being committed in Ukraine.
Yes, we will, of course, talk more about Ukrainian case and how it can be applied to this. But I would like to start from fundamentals of international justice. Can you explain what is an international tribunal and the International Criminal Court? Like, in simple terms, how does the system work, and what are the key differences between temporary tribunals as for Yugoslavia and Rwanda and others and the permanent ICC?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think one should just look at international criminal courts or tribunals that are independent bodies, judicial bodies, whose purpose is really to prosecute individuals for committing certain crimes. And the crimes that most of these tribunals focus on are what are referred to as atrocity crimes. And these are the most serious crimes committed, either war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. Those are in essence what these courts have focused on in the past on that. And the ICC then, the International Criminal Court, is structured in the same way, but it can be seen as the permanent international court. So you had mentioned temporary courts, which would have covered what I just mentioned before, the court dealing with the former Yugoslavia, also the court dealing with Rwanda, the courts dealing either in Cambodia or Lebanon. All of these were ad hoc tribunals specific to a particular event or series of events. The ICC, established in 2002, is really the first then permanent international court that has been created in the world. And similar to what I said earlier about the jurisdiction of this court over certain crimes, what I refer to as atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and the crime of aggression, actually, which is a bit unique for the ICC. And it was created with states that were willing to become members, to sign up for the court, to be state members. And so these members are kind of voluntarily accept the ICC's jurisdiction, and that's how it's structured. And that's the base of the ICC's work, is on that.
Yes, but for example, Mongolia didn't arrest Putin when he visited the state, and like there was no consequences for Mongolia for that, basically. So it's just voluntarily, right?
Yeah, I think that's, again, it's a good point, because I think we have to realize that international justice, particularly within the context of the International Criminal Court as the permanent court, it's not a perfect structure. There's not perfection here. And it's based on, the ICC doesn't have a police force, it doesn't have an army. We know that it also doesn't have all members of the international community who are state parties to the Rome Statute, the statute of the International Criminal Court. So it's not perfect. And fundamentally, it requires the political willingness of states to support the court in its decisions, in its structure. And if you're a state party, you're actually obligated to adhere to the decisions of the court. Mongolia is a state party. They were obligated to ensure that Mr. Putin was apprehended and arrested. That's one of the fundamental responsibilities of a state party. They failed in doing that. And so the consequences of that are, for me, not quite as significant as they should be. They will be perhaps ostracized, certainly criticized by other state parties to the Rome Statute. But this will be done, if you will, behind the scenes, in hopes that they haven't set a precedent for other state parties to simply ignore their responsibilities to support the court. Because if that happens, then the whole structure of international justice under the ICC will begin to erode, and that's a serious development.
And we also have a situation where the United States opposed the Rome Statute and the ICC, and also Trump imposed sanctions on the ICC. Is there a big issue? How do you think? Because that's a really powerful country.
Well, we have to also remember that the ICC has 125 state parties. 125 countries have signed up and have ratified, approved the Rome Statute, and are now state parties to the ICC. They're members of the ICC, including Ukraine, of course. They were the 125th. So we have to accept, or we have to acknowledge that this is a very significant number within the international community. But at the same time, you are right. There are some key states that are not members of the ICC. The United States is one, Israel, China, Russia no longer. All these states, I think, are important to build up this structure of international justice. But even without their participation, international justice can move forward, and I think it can be important. It would be much better for these countries, to be members of the state parties, but they are not. And so we have to go forward with the 125 who are, and to continue to build up that capacity to support international justice.
Okay, let's move on to closer to Ukraine. Which international tribunals experience do you think is the most relevant and useful for Ukraine?
Well, another good question. in a short answer, I would say all of them are.
Oh,
They
of
all
course.
have, yeah, they all have different components that I think are important. There are, as I say, other than the ICC, and the ICC is exceedingly important and is the one that has the greatest collaboration with Ukraine on ensuring that those individuals from Russia are brought to justice. But if you look at the creation, as I said, of the Tribunal for Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, and even this special mechanism, the international mechanism that exists, because both of those tribunals have now closed, but you still have the remnants of those tribunals. And so Ukraine can still learn from them. And then, of course, you have these treaty-based tribunals between the state and other international organizations. And we had mentioned earlier the Cambodia Tribunal. That's an example. The Special Court in Sierra Leone. That's an example. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon. That's an example where states entered into an agreement with, in this case, with the United Nations to create a tribunal. This might be the closest example for Ukraine vis-a-vis the crime of aggression, because we're talking about the creation of another special tribunal specific for the crime of aggression targeting Russian leaders. And so the idea of Ukraine coming together and coming with a special agreement, I think with the Council of Europe, that's an example of looking back in history and showing how other treaties and agreements were handled. And so I think there's lots of examples, and I think a good deal of help, insight from previous tribunals that will be of assistance to Ukraine. But I should note that Ukraine is undertaking its own domestic war crimes trials, as we know. And this is very consistent with the International Criminal Court statute, because the International Criminal Court is only the court of last resort. They only interfere, they're only engage if a country is unable or unwilling to undertake investigations and prosecutions on their own. Ukraine is doing that. They're willing and able. And I think history will see that actually most of the accountability will be occurring through Ukrainians' own efforts. And I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, of course, I agree with you. And we all know that Ukraine is collecting evidences against Russians, yes, and does a really good job in this. And I also wanted to talk with you about precedents, because every international tribunal created some precedents that we can use in Ukrainian cases, I understand. For example, in Rwanda, rape was first recognized as a component of genocide. Can this precedent be applied to Russia's crimes in Bucha, Irpin, and other temporarily occupied regions?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a perfect example of where the experience of previous tribunals will give a great insight and I think significant guidance to Ukraine for its own trials that it's undertaking. And this is, if you go back to, for instance, the ICTY, the tribunal I'm familiar with, along with Cambodia, is, the ICTY developed lots of doctrine, lots of standards dealing with international criminal cases, and Ukraine is following those doctrines. It's learning from those doctrines as well, and that's one of the examples. And I might add one very specific point that Ukraine is already successfully doing, and that deals with the need to ensure that domestic trials meet international standards of fairness and impartiality. And this also means ensuring that suspects, defendants, are given sufficient representation and that their rights are upheld, that due process is upheld. That's not an easy thing to accept, particularly when Ukraine is in a state of war. But I've always said that part of Ukraine's legacy in the field of international law will be how it's judged in its domestic tribunals, its domestic cases for war crimes. And as you know, I've been very involved with the process in Ukraine on the domestic prosecutions. And I have to say, I give it very, very high marks. I give Ukraine very high marks for how it's undertaking these domestic trials, even though most of them are trials in absentia. But that's really important. And that comes directly from experiences of other international tribunals that didn't oftentimes spend as much time focusing on those points. Ukraine is, and Ukraine will be credited for that in history.
Yes, thank you very much for your comments on that. And also, I would like to ask about propaganda, because propaganda played a key role in the genocide in Rwanda. Can Russian propaganda be classified as incitement to genocide, in your opinion?
Yeah, there's a lot of case law on this. There's a lot of areas where it's not as easy to say, well, propaganda itself is sufficient to ensure that individuals are brought to justice, because propaganda oftentimes is seen as just simply free speech. But where it does happen is what you just mentioned, that propaganda that moves into the incitement to commit these crimes or commit genocide generally, then that is absolutely relevant. And I think Russia has shown time and time again, through the use of propaganda, but most importantly, through the use of policies that actually incite these types of crimes, then yes, I think there will be relevance consistent with what other tribunals, particularly Rwanda, did on that area. So it's important for Ukraine to focus on that incitement part. That's a fundamental element of the crime of genocide. Is you don't have to, in the incitement, you have to prove the policies towards inciting genocide. That alone is a crime and can be brought, individuals can be held accountable for that. So I think it's very important.
As for April 2024, as Wikipedia says, I'm sorry I didn't find most recent data, but efforts to establish a special tribunal are supported by 44 states, if I'm not mistaken, maybe you can correct me, and 4 international organizations. Why has the special tribunal not been created yet, and what should Ukraine do to make it happen?
Well, it's complicated. One, as I mentioned earlier, the International Criminal Court now has within its statute the ability to prosecute for the crime of aggression, but because of limitations, restrictions within the statute for the particular instance of Russia's alleged crime of aggression against Ukraine, the ICC does not have jurisdiction, so the international community has to look through another procedure, another process to ensure that this crime can be prosecuted. And this debates and the work towards creating a special tribunal for the crime of aggression has been ongoing since 3 years ago with Russia's again invasion of Ukraine. As we know, the crime of, and the reason for me it's so important because the crime of aggression really focuses on the political and military leaders who are planning and preparing and executing this kind of act of aggression. And for me, that's why it's important, because it's Vladimir Putin more than anybody else that is responsible for this crime of aggression. And looking at him as the architect behind this war against Ukraine, the act of aggression, this to me is exceedingly important to ensure that this tribunal is created. But there needs to be, there are complications here. One, I've always argued that this should be an international tribunal. And the reason for is two reasons. One, this is a crime not just against Ukraine. The crime of aggression is a crime against humanity at large. And for me, the international community should come together to ensure that those who've committed this crime are brought to justice. So it shouldn't just be Ukraine's responsibility. It should be the international responsibility. Second, it's important under law that it is an international tribunal, because that's the only way you can ensure that high-ranking officials like a sitting head of state Putin are brought to justice and are not protected by head of state immunity, which is fundamental in international law. But if you were creating a special tribunal that's truly international, then the head of state immunity no longer exists. It can be dismissed. So that's why it's really important for this to happen. But it's been slow. The Council of Europe, though, has made significant steps in moving forward with a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. There's even a draft statute now that exists. So things are moving forward. I'm hoping that in the end, this special tribunal, does in fact come to fruition. It needs to.
But it looks like we're running out of time, because if Ukraine and Russia sign a peace agreement, that this tribunal can just not happen. In my opinion, correct me if I'm wrong, but how would this affect the likelihood of creating the special tribunal, this agreement that we're talking, like everyone is talking about?
Yeah. Well, your opinion's not wrong. Your opinion is sadly, it's absolutely correct. We had always hoped, I had always hoped in pushing for the special tribunal that it would have been created a long time ago, because it's much more difficult to eliminate, to ignore the existence of a tribunal if it's already created. It's much easier to dismiss it if it's never been created. And I think you're right. I think there's a potential that the tribunal could be it could be a casualty of these negotiations. Having said that, the Council of Europe has been very firm now, and I think it's been almost unanimous in the desire to create this this special tribunal for the crime of aggression. If things continue to move to a negotiation where the European voice becomes much stronger, forced to do so because of the United States retreat from being serious in creating a peaceful resolution on this war that also benefits the interest of Ukraine, then I think it's still possible for the European countries to stand firm in saying, for the sake of Europe, we're going to insist that this tribunal exist. Maybe they'll compromise. Maybe they will dismiss, or maybe they say we will recognize head of state immunity, and so therefore the troika, the three main players in Russia, would not be they would not be targeted in a court proceeding now, but they would still be able to gain evidence to pursue cases, so that when Mr. Putin is no longer in office, then he could be held accountable. And that, I think, can easily happen. So you're correct that it's much more complicated right now, but I'm not willing to give up yet the idea that that we would not have a special tribunal for the crime of aggression that's focused on the leadership of Russia. We need to have that.
So may we have the case after likely negotiations in the future? Can we have the case where we cannot arrest or do anything to state leaders, but we can hold accountable these war criminals like generals, soldiers, and other people who committed crimes in this war?
Yes, yes. So you're doing that. We're doing that right now. The ICC has already issued arrest warrants on several individuals. In addition to Putin and Lvova Belova, there are also 4 military personnel who have also been indicted for war crimes. So the ICC will continue to pursue these individuals. And of course, the ICC does not recognize head of state immunity. So if the indictments are coming from the ICC, we don't need to be concerned about whether or not Mr. Putin is a head of state, because the ICC doesn't recognize head of state immunity, which is why they issued arrest warrants for him. So that can continue to happen for anybody in Russia at any level. The crime of aggression, and by the way, we know that within the Ukrainian national system, those investigations and prosecutions for war crimes violations and other atrocity crimes are also moving forward. Yeah, yes, they will be limited against a sitting head of state like Mr. Putin, but there's no limitations about pursuing generals or any other military political leaders other than the troika. And then finally, the special tribunal for the crime of aggression. Remember, that's focused on those most responsible for planning and activating the policies to commit these crimes of aggression. But that's not just Putin. That's other leaders, other political and military leaders. So this tribunal could also pursue them, even though they may still be in their positions. And then they could investigate other leaders who would be protected under the head of state immunity. But that is with the aim of ensuring that they're brought to justice when they're no longer in office. And so there's a number of ways to continue to put pressure and focus on Russia and its leaders for the crimes that they've committed in Ukraine. It's a bit like a puzzle, and there's different pieces. And so we need to use all of those to ensure that generally justice will be brought and justice will be there for Ukraine.
And is it possible that we will see cancellation of this arrest warrants as part of negotiations?
Well, again, it's a really good question. I mentioned when you first asked me about how the international courts are structured. And I said, well, first and foremost, these are independent judicial bodies. And so they're not controlled by states. And so the only way that you could stop these prosecutions, you could stop the prosecutor in the court, is if the UN Security Council, under a special article within the Rome Statute, would ask, or would not ask, would require the ICC to stop its investigations for a period of time against Russian leaders, for instance, Mr. Putin. But that will not happen because there won't be a full. I don't think it will happen because there wouldn't be a full commitment by the permanent members of the Security Council for that to happen. But it is possible. But generally, my view is that the ICC is independent. It pursues the evidence, and as long as there's political willingness among its members and the general legal community to support the investigations and the eventual apprehension of these individuals, then I think the ICC will continue to be quite relevant.
Thank you very much. And my final question, it's time for my final question because we're running out of time. I'm so sorry. I hope that we will finish on a positive note. At least I hope that this note will be positive. You have spent many years working in international justice. So in your opinion, will this conflict between Russia and Ukraine become a precedent that changes the system of international justice? And will all perpetrators be held accountable in the future?
Well, that is
hard to keep positive, I know.
But that is the question. That is the key question here. You've touched upon the question, and I wrote an op-ed several weeks ago that asked the question: are we witnessing the end of international law? And I asked that question because we're at the 80th anniversary of the creation of the UN Charter. And the most fundamental principle in the UN Charter is the prohibition of one state taking forceful action against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. That is what Russia has done against Ukraine. That is the most fundamental principle of the UN Charter, in my opinion. So therefore, there is much at stake here. And it's why I believe that the international community and why I believe what we're seeing out of Europe is so important, that they're saying we need to ensure that Russia is held accountable for these fundamental crimes that they're committing. Because if they don't, what's the point of international law? And this is the question I would ask the United States, and specifically the White House. Are you willing to give up the very fundamental elements of international law that was born out of the Holocaust, out of World War II, in order to support and to ensure that a dictator like Mr. Putin succeeds in his efforts? That's not something you want to be a part of. And that's my message to the United States. And I say that as an American.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting interview. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was...
Any time that you need to talk, you just let me know and we'll be happy to do that.
Sure. Right? Thank you very much.
Okay.
That was Mark Ellis, Executive Director of the International Bar Association and an expert in international criminal law. We discussed the lessons from international tribunals that could help Ukraine hold Russian war criminals accountable for their actions. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video and leave comments below.